Now, I definitely can't say it's a normal thing to start a video about swords and the usage of swords by reading passages from the Bible, uh, but it's necessary for this one, so here we go. This first verse or series verse I'm going to read is actually from Luke chapter 22, and it starts in verse 49. It's dealing with the arrest of Jesus and what one of the disciples does. In verse 49 it says, "And when those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And in verse 50 it says, 'And a certain one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear.'" Now, every gospel book in the Bible actually has this story told pretty much the same way. I chose Luke and then subsequently John, which I'll read out of, for two reasons. One is that Luke is very specific in saying the right ear. All the other ones just say struck off his ear. And then in John chapter 18, verse 10, the telling of it says, "Simon Peter," so very specifically who we will call from here on out Saint Peter, "therefore having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus." Now, I have some really big problems with this, and I want to dissect it because I think it's one of those weird, interesting things that you can pull from the Bible and talk about swords. All right, so this story is probably one of the most infamous things Peter ever did in the Bible, and I think that it has a lot of interesting history behind it within the Catholic Church because they actually have a relic that they call the Sword of St. Peter. It's actually like this giant falchion-looking thing. I don't think it's accurate. I think it might be a fake, but it's more than likely some sort of medieval recreation. Swords that came from that time period and that location probably looked a bit more like this because the Romans were occupying and they had these types of swords in general. So this is a gladius. It doesn't have to be a gladius, but for our purposes, it will be the gladius. And the gladius is much more thrusting sword. Whether or not that's the type of sword Peter had, I don't know. But here we go. We're going to talk about it like this is what Peter had, and not a giant falchion, which is interesting because the falchion is shown a lot in medieval art in terms of Peter using it to cut off people's ear. Really strange. But cutting off an ear is, in my estimation, in my opinion, a really hard thing to actually do with precision and intent, and a much easier thing to do with really bad sword form. So let's talk through it. All right, so we know from the book of Luke that they say he cut off his right ear. Now, a strike to the right-hand side of an opponent is actually not all that common if you are right-handed. More than likely, most people, including Peter, are right-handed. He was probably right-handed, and so when he drew the sword, normally it would be here, and when he strikes, it would actually be to his opponent's left ear. The attack would come in this way. So that's not the ear that's going to be cut off. Okay, so how is he likely attacking? Well, he has it hidden, probably under a robe, and it says that he drew it and struck. And I would actually read that as he drew it and struck. So he kept it hidden till the very last second, pulled it out, and struck at that priest's servant. So it's just a servant guy. Poor guy. Of all the people, just attack the poor servant. But there he is. So he's hiding it. And he pulls out and he strikes. Okay? So he makes a strike. And that's going to be the right ear. Now here's the thing. If you look at whether it's popular film or people trying to interpret this for various reasons, and I'm actually going to show a clip here from Passion of the Christ without sound. So hopefully I don't get a copyright strike. You can see that they have this really weird kind of tuffle, and he kind of strikes with a thrust, a weird thrust that knocks the guy's helmet off and it cuts his ear off. And I think this is the filmmaker's intent or their attempt to make it make sense. Because here's the thing, if you're striking at someone close enough to hit their ear, you're hitting something other than their ear. You're hitting their head or their neck, right? You're hitting this area, a very vital area. You're going to be smacking it with a sharp blade, right? How is that going to just cut off the ear? Well, here is where I then argue maybe Peter is actually just a terrible swordsman. Here's the concept. There's this wonderful thing called edge alignment. It really matters when you're making a cut. See, edge alignment is the concept of taking, well, the edge of the blade and ensuring that it's properly aligned with your target so that it doesn't glance off, that it actually catches and cuts through. And essentially what this looks like is if I come straight on, it would hit. However, if my edge alignment is off, it'll just bounce off. And with a soft target, it might kind of slice in, but the head is kind of a hard target. So if I'm striking with good edge alignment, I'm cutting into the head. So I'm doing this on myself here, right? Don't worry, not sharp, it's blunt. I'm not silly. But if it's bad edge alignment, if it's turned just wrong, it's going to hit with the flat on the side of the head. And where's the momentum of this sword blade going to go? It's going to come straight down into the soft part, the part that has a nice little notch on it that the blade can go right into and lop off an ear perfectly. Cut off that ear. Now all that momentum is going to be lost, and maybe it would bounce off the shoulder, but likely it would just kind of lose momentum, and that'd be about it. With a sharp sword, bad edge alignment on the skull, you're probably just going to cut off an ear. So is that what St. Peter did? Does that guy have like the world's worst edge alignment, and was that captured in one of the most read books in all of history? Poor guy. He'll never catch a break in that. In fact, it's really funny because he is known for having used a sword, one of the few that you can actually say in the Bible of the apostles that used a sword. Yet in popular art, when they show Peter with Paul, one of the other non-apostles, but a person who in the Bible called himself an apostle, they're always shown together, and Paul has a sword. Peter has keys. Yeah, no one wants to give Peter the sword, not even in popular art of the time anyway, like medieval art and stuff like that. So I find this really funny. I find it really fascinating. Now, this is a thing that's actually done by a lot of people who practice HEMA or kind of do general historical research on sword fighting. I actually spoke a bit about this, and it's certainly very well reflected in the book about Polish sword fighting by Richard Marsden, because he talked about how you can kind of pull sources, but eventually you kind of run out of like the actual strict manuals of fight books, and you have to then kind of look at like historical accounts of fights, and that's kind of what they've done with some Polish sword forms and fighting, as they've read about some accounts, and there are accounts, really well written accounts of duels and brawls and even warfare on the battlefield and what happens with a sword and that. And you can actually apply those same practices that we just went through with biblical passages. You can apply them to these things. You can actually play act. You can figure out what could have happened, how the fight would have looked. And I think it's a really, really fun thing to do. I've wanted to do this video for a really long time because I find it one of those fascinating things that, you can read like a passage in the Bible, and you read it and you just go, oh, okay, this is a passage from the Bible. But then if you were to try to dissect it with a sword, and you were to actually think about how that would work in fighting, and how, no, that's not going to cut the right ear, and there's these weird things you might do, but what if it was just really bad edge alignment? There goes the ear. Cheers, guys.